You kneel on the cold marble floor, the stone biting through your thin sandals, your hands trembling as you press them against the altar. The sacred flame, the eternal fire of Vesta, flickers once, twice, and then dies into smoke. The smell of extinguished embers clings to your throat, acrid, suffocating. In the cavernous silence of the temple, every whisper seems magnified. The rustle of robes in the corridor, the low murmur of priests gathering in judgment. You know what comes next. The decree has already been written. The earth outside the Colline Gate has been hollowed, a chamber prepared, not for the dead, but for the still breathing. You will be carried there beneath solemn chants, entombed with oil, bread, and water, until silence itself consumes you. In Rome, to fail was not simply to stumble, it was to forfeit breath. Sacred purity was never a shield, only a death sentence disguised as honor. And yet this was Rome, the empire of colosseums and aqueducts, the ruler of continents. Beneath marble arches and gilded victories, its most sacred women lived shackled by terror. Their lives were not only celebrated as divine, but weaponized as instruments of fear. If this glimpse into forgotten shadows grips you, subscribe and drop a comment on where you're tuning in from. It fuels more unearthings like this. For over 1,000 years, Rome's Vestal virgins stood at the center of civic religion, guardians of the flame said to ensure the city's survival. But their sanctity was no protection. Their punishments weren't whispers of rumor or isolated tragedies. They were systematic, codified by law, carried out under the gaze of emperors, priests, and the people who believed Rome itself would fall without them. Chroniclers like Plutarch, Livy, and Aulus Gellius recorded these terrors, while the ruins of the Atrium Vestae still whisper their fate. 3 punishments above all froze Rome in dread, each more terrifying than the last. The decree is read aloud not in anger, but in solemn ritual. A Vestal virgin, judged impure, does not face a common execution. Rome believed to spill her blood was sacrilege. And so, in a cruel twist of logic, they devised a punishment more horrifying than death by sword. She was buried alive. Picture the process. At dawn, the condemned Vestal is led out from the Atrium Vestae. The streets of Rome fall silent as she passes, flanked by lictors, her veil pulled tightly around her head. There are no jeers, no cries of pity, only the hush of a city witnessing its own supposed purification. Her very existence, once holy, has become contamination. The sight awaits beyond the Colline Gate. A pit dug in the earth, wide enough for a small room, furnished with a couch, a lamp, a little bread, and a jug of water. Livy writes that these objects were placed inside not to comfort her, but to mock mercy, to claim that Rome had not killed her directly, but simply abandoned her to fate. The earth itself became executioner. She is escorted down into the darkness. Priests seal the entrance, shovelful by shovelful, until the sunlight disappears. Silence descends. Alone in that suffocating chamber, her breath becomes the only sound. Plutarch records that in the reign of Domitian, the Vestal Cornelia was condemned this way. When soldiers tried to strip her, she fought, insisting she had lived pure. But her words fell into the pit, buried with her cries. This was not an accident of cruelty. It was systematic, a system designed to terrify every young girl who entered the priesthood. To guard the flame was not just a ritual duty, it was survival. The punishment was performed publicly yet ended in silence, leaving a lingering fear across Rome. If even the sacred could be buried alive, what hope had the rest? But the horror did not end with burial. There were other terrors, inflicted not to kill, but to humiliate. If the eternal flame of Vesta went out, even for a moment, the virgins responsible faced punishment at the hands of the Pontifex Maximus himself. The punishment was scourging, a whipping administered in secret beneath the earth in darkness. Aulus Gellius tells us that the pontiff would enter with rods, striking the girl whose duty it had been to guard the fire. Why in secret? Because the Vestals were sacrosanct. No one could see their bodies shamed in public. And yet the beating had to be given, for Rome believed that the extinguishing of the flame endangered the state. Imagine the psychology, the entire empire's fate. the legions on the Rhine, the grain fleets from Egypt, the safety of the emperor himself was said to rest upon the body of a single girl kneeling in the shadows, waiting for the whip. She would be struck, blood drawn in darkness, and then sent back to guard the flame as if nothing had happened. The paradox is chilling. Rome exalted these women as divine symbols, placing them above marriage, above ordinary law. Yet the same Rome reduced them to trembling victims, beaten in the dark, entombed in silence, used as scapegoats for cosmic disaster. Records treat these punishments with the cold precision of bureaucracy. Ledgers note trials, accusations, condemnations, never names, only functions. One Vestal condemned, bread and lamp provided. Euphemism after euphemism, the language of ritual masking the reality of horror. This was psychological warfare on an industrial scale. It ensured obedience, not just from the 6 virgins alive at any moment, but from every Roman who whispered their fate into the ears of daughters and sons. And still, the most devastating punishment remained, for suspicion alone could unravel entire families, dragging innocent bloodlines into disgrace. That is where our second half begins. Rome's punishments did not stop at the pit or the lash. They reached further into the very roots of family and society. For even the suspicion of impurity was enough to unmake a household, to shatter legacies carefully built across generations. The logic was simple and merciless. If a Vestal was sacred, then her fall tainted not only herself, but all who had raised her. Fathers, brothers, even uncles bore the weight of her disgrace. Their honors could be stripped, their estates confiscated, their reputations erased from public life. A single accusation transformed a lineage into a stain. Cassius Dio recounts that in 1104 BCE, several Vestals were accused of breaking their vows. Some were executed by burial. Others, condemned on weaker evidence, were still paraded as guilty. Their families fell with them. In the cold mathematics of empire, Rome ensured that impurity was never an individual matter. It was collective annihilation. This was not only justice, it was political weaponry. Emperors and senators alike understood the terrors such accusations carried. Domitian, notorious for wielding suspicion like a blade, accused multiple Vestals during his reign. To bury them alive was to display Rome's moral ferocity, but also to silence critics, to seize estates, to prove that even the holiest bloodlines bowed to imperial authority. Archaeological fragments from the Atrium Vestae show inscriptions once celebrating families who had daughters in the order. These plaques stand as eerie reminders. The honor of a Vestal daughter could turn to ruin overnight. What was recorded in marble one year could be defaced or erased the next. Imagine the psychological toll. To be chosen as a Vestal was to be exalted, snatched from childhood into a life of sacred privilege, freed from the threat of marriage or childbirth. Parents wept with pride. Yet the same parents must have whispered prayers in dread, knowing that if their daughter faltered, they too would be dragged into disgrace. Every feast, every sacrifice, every procession through Rome carried the shadow of that fear. Public humiliation amplified the terror. When suspicion arose, the Virgin was not quietly judged in private chambers. She was led in procession, the city forced to bear witness. Crowds would gather as priests escorted her to the tribunal. Her veil would be pulled forward, her silence demanded, her face hidden from the people. Rome claimed this was to preserve her modesty. In truth, it was a theater of power, her body covered, yet her fate exposed. Even acquittal did not heal the wound. The mere act of accusation poisoned the air. Whispers lingered. Families retreated from public life, scarred by the brush with dishonor. The law had turned suspicion into punishment, destroying lives without the need for proof. The system was efficient because it was euphemistic. Chroniclers write of ritual purification, of safeguarding Rome's eternity. But beneath these words lay systematic brutality. Accusation, humiliation, burial, scourging, each step cloaked in piety, each act framed as devotion rather than cruelty. Rome needed its citizens to believe that terror was duty, that annihilation was purification, and so the most terrifying punishments endured for centuries. What makes this machinery of control so chilling is not only its cruelty, but its normalization. Children in Rome grew up knowing the story of the buried Vestals. Playwrights referenced them, philosophers warned of them, gossip spread like wildfire. The terror became folklore, woven into the very identity of Rome. And the virgins themselves lived in that shadow. They lit the sacred fire with trembling hands, knowing that its extinction meant not only a blow of the whip, but the possible ruin of everyone they loved. Consider the scale: 6 virgins at a time, across nearly 1,000 years. Dozens, perhaps hundreds, passed through the order. Each carried the same burden, the same knowledge that failure, even rumor of failure, would erase not just their life, but their family name. It was psychological warfare on a generational level. The empire had transformed purity into a weapon, wielded not only against women, but against the very fabric of Roman society. And so, across centuries, 3 punishments defined the dread of Rome: the burial alive, the scourging in darkness, and the ruin of families by accusation. These were not accidents of cruelty. They were deliberate, methodical, and sustained. The virgins stood at the symbolic heart of the empire, but they also stood on the edge of an abyss where every step carried the weight of annihilation. This was Rome's paradox. The same civilization that built aqueducts and roads to bind continents together, that carved marble into timeless beauty, also institutionalized terror at the core of its most sacred institution. To be a Vestal virgin was to live between exaltation and dread, adored in ceremony, abandoned in silence. The empire called it sanctity. History remembers it as horror. The punishments of the Vestals were not random eruptions of cruelty. They were the gears of a larger machine, one Rome itself depended upon. To understand their terror, you must see how the empire wove sanctity and brutality together until they became inseparable. At the core were numbers. 6 Vestals served at any given time. 6 women, no more, no less, upon whom the empire's very survival was said to rest. Their purity symbolized the health of Rome. If the flame faltered, the city trembled. If a virgin fell, Rome sought scapegoats in her bloodline. The machine worked because it was precise, predictable, systematic. Consider the calculations. Every 30 years or so, new girls were chosen to replace those whose service ended. They were drawn from noble families, inspected like livestock, their physical health judged as carefully as their lineage. To be chosen was honor beyond measure, but the honor was double-edged. The same city that crowned them sacred prepared pits in advance, as if expecting failure. The message was chilling. Exaltation and annihilation were 2 sides of the same Roman coin. Political leaders exploited this logic. An emperor accused of tyranny could point to an impure Vestal and declare that the gods themselves demanded cleansing. Domitian did this with ruthless flair, parading accusations as proof of his own divine authority. The burial of Vestals became theater, a demonstration that Rome's morality was intact, even as emperors themselves wallowed in vice. The paradox was the point, and the people believed it. Rumor of a virgin's failure sent waves of panic through the streets. Mothers whispered warnings to daughters. Fathers reminded sons that Rome's eternity depended on 6 trembling women. Entire villages feared that the extinction of the flame would bring famine, invasion, or plague. Thus, the punishments achieved what no legion could: obedience born of dread. It was psychological warfare perfected. The empire conquered with armies, but it ruled with rituals. A whip in the dark, a burial pit sealed in silence. These were spectacles of the unseen. The terror spread not because people witnessed it, but because they imagined it. Rome did not need to execute every virgin. It needed only a few to fall, so that the rest and the millions who watched would carry the fear for generations. Pause and consider this. An empire of 80 million souls anchored its fate to 6 women who lived as both goddesses and prisoners. Their exaltation was their cage, their purity, their executioner. Rome's greatness was built on aqueducts and roads, yes, but it also rested on pits of silence dug in the earth, waiting for the sacred to stumble. And this was only the beginning of the machine's revelation. For the system was not just about punishing failure. It was about reproducing terror across centuries, normalizing the unthinkable until it became the natural order of Roman life. The true horror of Rome's system lies in how it perpetuated itself. These punishments did not merely correct error, they created cycles of fear that ensured their own survival. Every generation of Vestals grew up hearing the same stories, of Cornelia buried alive, of sisters scourged in darkness, of families ruined by whispers. These tales were repeated in schools, in markets, in barracks, until they became as permanent as Rome's marble arches. The machine of terror did not need constant executions. It needed memory. Trauma became tradition, and tradition became law. The feedback loops were chilling. When famine struck, people asked, had a virgin sinned? When war went badly, they wondered, had the flame faltered? The punishment of the few became explanation for the suffering of the many. In this way, the state weaponized superstition, binding civic life to the bodies of its virgins. Every calamity became another justification for scrutiny, another opportunity for accusations, another chance for Rome to display its merciless devotion. This cycle bred perverse incentives. Politicians found it convenient to accuse Vestals during unstable times. By punishing them, the empire could project strength, cleanse itself in the eyes of the gods, and distract from the corruption of its rulers. The virgins' bodies became political instruments, wielded in public silence and private fear. Even the so-called mercy of secrecy played into the machinery. Scourgings were conducted underground, hidden from view, but the secrecy only magnified the dread. What people could not see, they imagined. A whispered tale of blood in the shadows spreads faster, lasts longer, than any spectacle in the Colosseum. By keeping punishments shrouded, Rome allowed imagination to do the work of terror. And so, terror became normalized. Generations of Romans grew up believing that this was simply the order of things, that the survival of the empire required burying its sacred daughters alive, whipping them in the dark, and erasing families at a stroke of suspicion. What should have been shocking became ritual. What should have been barbaric became divine. It is here the paradox reaches its peak. Rome, the empire that conquered the known world, relied not only on steel and stone, but on the broken bodies of a handful of young women. Their lives were consumed to maintain the illusion of eternity, and society accepted it. Parents still vied for their daughters to be chosen, not out of ignorance, but because the honor was irresistible, even if it carried the threat of annihilation. Pause and imagine the silence after the earth closed over a virgin's body. Above, the empire marched on. Armies, senators, emperors proclaiming glory. Beneath, in the darkness, one woman suffocated for the sins of a city. This silence was not absence. It was the sound of empire working as designed. That is the revelation. Rome's most terrifying punishments were not aberrations. They were the logic of power itself. And by accepting them, by institutionalizing them, Rome taught its people to see cruelty not as horror but as necessity. When we step back from the ledgers, the pits, the whispered accusations, a pattern emerges far more chilling than any single punishment. Rome did not simply punish its virgins, it normalized their terror until it became the silent heartbeat of the empire. The paradox is stark. This was a civilization that gave the world aqueducts, paved roads, marble amphitheaters, poetry, and law. Its brilliance dazzled across continents. Yet, at the very core of its identity, at the altar of its eternity, stood 6 trembling women, exalted as divine yet disposable as kindling. Their sanctity was never freedom. It was a leash tightened by priests and emperors alike. The scars endure, not in monuments, but in memory. Chroniclers like Plutarch, Livy, Cassius Dio recorded their fates with cold detachment, as though noting rainfall or eclipses. Archaeologists still trace the atrium Vestae, where the flame once burned, its stones whispering of silenced voices. And through the centuries, their story echoes as warning. When power weds itself to fear, no sanctity is safe. Consider how entire families collapsed because a daughter faltered. How parents lived in pride and dread, knowing their child's honor could become the family's ruin. Consider how secrecy itself became terror. How punishment behind closed doors fed imaginations darker than spectacle ever could. These were not excesses. They were the order of things. And yet, the lesson is not only Rome's. Every age risks turning its most sacred values into instruments of control. The fragility of civilization lies here, in the speed with which dignity can be sacrificed to preserve the illusion of eternity. Rome buried virgins alive to protect its empire. What do we sacrifice today, and to whom do we entrust that power? By remembering, we restore. The women Rome silenced cannot speak, but their stories can be told. They were not only symbols of purity or failures of duty, they were human, caught in a machine larger than themselves, their breaths extinguished so marble might gleam a little brighter. So when we look at Rome's grandeur, the arches, the roads, the eternal flame, we must also look beneath, into the pits dug for the sacred and discarded. For history's greatness is never free of shadow, and the measure of empire is not only what it builds, but whom it buries. If this history unsettled you, subscribe and share in the comments which punishment shocked you most. We'll confront the next buried truth together. Because the flame of remembrance burns not in temples, but in us.